the Gulf, the prospects for Iranian-Saudi reconciliation. Today, we'll be discussing the Iran-Saudi agreement brokered by China on 10th March of this year. And we have with us Dr. Shelley Johnny and Dr. Stanley Johnny. Center for Public Policy Research is an independent public policy think tank based out in Kochi in the Indian state of Kerala. Our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformations in the areas of international relations and security, livelihood, education, urban reform, health, governance, etc. To know what we do, please do visit our website www.cppr.in and our social media accounts. I am Neelima, Research Associate at CPPR, your moderator for today's discussion. One second, I think the voice is breaking. We'll just check into the internet connection. One second. I'm so sorry. Hello, I think my voice is clear now. Is it okay?
Yeah, I think it is clear.
I think it was breaking last time.
Okay, it seems to be okay. I think it seems to be okay now.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm starting once again. Hello, everyone. Welcome to CPPR webinar on Bridging the Gulf, the prospects for Iranian-Saudi reconciliation. Today, we will be discussing the Iran-Saudi agreement brokered by China on 10th March of this year. And we have with us Dr. Stanley Johnny and Dr. Shelley Johnny. Center for Public Policy Research is an independent public policy think tank based out in Kochi in the Indian state of Kerala. Our engagement with public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, institutional transformation in the areas of international relations and security, livelihood, education, urban reform, health, governance, law, etc. To know more about what we do, please do visit our website www.cppr.in and our social media accounts. I'm Neelima, Research Associate at CPPR, your moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all the participants who have logged in today from across the world. We look forward to engaging with you to enrich today's discussion. To put in your questions to the speakers, you can add them in the chat box as well. You can now also watch the live streaming of the webinar on our YouTube channel. You can also follow the event on Twitter. Keep track of the live feeds on #CPPR Dialogue. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Stanley Johnny. Dr. Stanley is the International Affairs Editor with The Hindu, a PhD in International Studies from the Center for West Asian Studies, JNU, New Delhi. He anchors the paper's international coverage besides writing editorials, op-eds, and other features. He has been writing on geopolitics and Indian foreign policy for over a decade and has reported from different parts of the world. He is the author of the two books, The ISIS Caliphate, Bloomsbury 2018, and The Comrades and the Mullahs, HarperCollins 2022. We welcome you to the discussion, Stanley.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to welcome our Senior Fellow, West Asian and Security Studies, Dr. Shelley Johnny, who is our second panelist for the discussion. Dr. Shelley Johnny is an Assistant Professor of Political Science Department at St. Aloysius College, Eluthurutu, Thrissur. He did his PhD in West Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has held research positions at Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi, which is a think tank of Indian Air Force, and the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA, New Delhi, which is under the Ministry of Defense, Government of India. Welcome, Dr. Shelley, to the webinar.
Thank you.
I'm sure that we'll have an engaging and insightful discussion ahead on bridging the Gulf, the prospect of Iranian and Saudi reconciliation. Iran and Saudi Arabia are two of the most powerful and influential countries in the West Asia, with a long history of diplomatic and geopolitical tensions due to differences over politics, religion, and oil wealth. As the tensions between the two regional powers have simmered over recent decades, it has given rise for a potential deal between the two countries. The historical division traces its origin to the early stages of Islam, resulting in diverse understanding of Islamic laws and customs. Iran, with a predominantly Shia Muslim population, and Saudi Arabia, with a predominantly Sunni Muslim population, are key players in this divide. Consequently, these differences have also contributed to a strained relation between the two nations and has given rise to proxy wars in the nations like Syria and Yemen. For example, in Yemen, Saudi has been supporting the government, whereas Iran has been supporting the Houthi rebels, which has led to a widespread instability in the region. The global ramifications of the competition over oil resources have been significant as well. Iran and Saudi Arabia are engaged in the rivalry for market dominance, which has shaped the worldwide oil markets and impacted economies across the globe. Despite the efforts to mitigate tensions, the persistent rivalry has hindered international organization stability to foster peace and stability in the region. The United States has been a principal power in the West Asia since the end of the World War II, with a clear motivation to capture and dominate the global oil market. America, using its military and economic power, has greatly influenced regional politics. Over the past few years, America has also adopted a milder interventionist approach while prioritizing domestic matters and reducing its military footprint in the region. The Iran nuclear deal had heightened the already tense relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. However, incidents like sanctions imposed by America, its inaction on the Saudi Arabia's oil facilities, being attacked by drones in 2019, and the many others that have made both the countries look out for their own national interests. And recently, on March 10, 2023, Iran and Saudi Arabia signed an agreement to restore the diplomatic ties under the auspices of China. Under this deal, both the countries would open missions and consulates in each other's capitals soon, and high-level visits from both the sides is likely to follow. Both sides have also promised to resume past security pacts and revisit agreements on trade and technology. And Iran-Saudi deal could also have significant implications for West Asia and the wider world, including the potential changes to regional security dynamics, economic relationships, and diplomatic alliances. A successful deal could also signal a shift towards a more stable and a cooperative regional order, while a breakdown in the negotiations could lead to increased tensions and conflicts. So without any further ado, I invite Stanley to give his introductory remarks, setting the stage for our in-depth exploration of the Iran-Saudi deal and its ramifications.
Thanks, Nilima, for the introduction, and thanks to CPPR for organizing this seminar. So this is the Iran-Saudi reconciliation agreement. I think is one of the most important rapprochements that is happening before us at this point of time. Because these two countries, as you pointed out, were two of the most important countries in West Asia, and these two are, they are in opposing camps, and this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it actually goes back to the pre-revolutionary era of Iran. You just look at the map, especially after the revolution, 1979 revolution, the contradictions between these two countries have sharpened. One is Sunni majority monarchy, and the other is a Shia majority theocratic republic. So you have, the contradiction between a monarchy and a republic, and then you have the sectarian contradiction between Shias and Sunnis, And also these two, in terms of resources, in terms of their geographic positioning, in terms of population, Saudi Arabia and Iran are very powerful countries. And both of them wanted to be the dominant player in West Asia, especially around the Gulf. And this has led to the rivalry between these two, and which had also triggered proxy conflicts in recent years. So especially in the last 10 years, you would see that Saudi Arabia and Iran would be supporting their proxies in different parts of West Asia. So this remained one of the major sources of instability in the region. And also from a larger geopolitical point of view, from 1979 onwards, Iran has declared the United States as the Great Satan and has taken a completely different foreign policy outlook from what the Iranian monarchy had followed. But Saudi Arabia since 1940s has remained a staunch American ally. So on the one side, you have an American ally, and on the other side, you have a country that saw the United States as the most important threat to their security. So there were many contradictions between these two countries. So then the question is why Saudi Arabia and Iran have reached this reconciliation agreement now in 2023. I think one of the most important aspects is that Saudi Arabia is undertaking a set of foreign policy recalibrations, because Saudi Arabia's traditional bet was that the United States would take care of its security, and Saudi Arabia would take care of the United States' energy needs, and Saudi Arabia would remain a major ally of the United States in the Gulf region. So Saudi Arabia remains and would continue to remain an American ally, but at the same time, there were some ruptures in this equation. One is that the United States is no longer dependent on the Gulf for energy security. The United States itself is now one of the top producers of oil in the world. So America's dependence on the region has come down. And secondly, the United States now faces much bigger conventional challenges elsewhere, so that its focus is slowly shifting away from West Asia. So in West Asia, Saudi Arabia sees this happening, the United States deprioritization of the region. And on the other side, Iran remains a major challenge. So initially, when Trump was the president, the plan was to weaken Iran through further sanctions. So President Trump dumped the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, etc., etc. So what the Trump administration called maximum pressure. But Iran responded to this through maximum resistance, because in 2019 we saw the Iranians or Iranian proxies attacking Saudi oil installations, and in Yemen, Houthis now pose a major security challenge not just to Saudi Arabia but also to the UAE. And tensions between the Iranians and the Israelis are now rising. So if there is a conflict breaks out in the future, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, they fear that they might get caught in the crossfire if there is a conflict in the future. So if you can't tame Iran using force at a time when the United States is deprioritizing the region, what you have to do? I think a sense of realism has prevailed here in Mohammed bin Salman's calculations about the region. So what he wanted now is some kind of stability in the relationship, some predictability in the relationship. So because you can see that Iran hasn't changed much in the last 5 years. That is not the trigger of Saudi Arabia's rapprochement. The trigger is Saudi Arabia's own realization that for stability in the region, for predictability in its relationship with Iran, at a time when Saudi Arabia is focusing on its own transformation, internal economic and geopolitical transformation, I think the Saudis have reached a consensus that they have to reach out to the Iranians. And now you have a big player in the region, which is China. And the Chinese have very good ties with both the Iranians and the Saudis. So the Chinese have come forward with this idea of negotiating, brokering talks between the two. So I think these geopolitical developments, as well as the foreign policy recalibration that is taking place in Riyadh, have prompted this, this reconciliation. On the other side, Iran continues to be under Western sanctions. And Iran is also facing a lot of domestic challenges because we saw prolonged protests in Iran in recent months, and protests keep coming back, challenging the regime. And, so Iran would also want some kind of relief in its, particularly when it is considering its tight economic and geopolitical situations. So the Iranians also found it convenient to respond to the Saudi, reconciliation or the Saudi outreach. So these, I think, circumstances set the stage for the agreement, but only the first part of the act has been done because there are challenges. We can discuss that going forward. But I think this is the broader, this is the background of the reconciliation agreement between the two. Thank you.
Yeah, it was very insightful to hear from you as a person who has been following this news and writing upon it and discussing upon it for the past recent month, where you have highlighted 2 points where Saudi is shifting its foreign policy where it is looking for a new foreign policy recalibration, and where Iran is also looking out for some relief from the existing thing. So it was really great hearing from you. We'll further discuss upon different aspects on the upcoming discussions. And now I invite Dr. Shelley Johnny to give us a brief understanding of the topic.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, Shelley.
You're audible.
Yeah. So first, I would like to thank CPPR for organizing this discussion on a very important topic, and also on a personal level, an opportunity to interact with an old friend from JNU. So we both have been doing our research in the Center for West Asian Studies at JNU. It was a brilliant opportunity to meet once again. I think Stanley has already covered much of the the reasons for this reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Especially, he is also focused on the role of external powers, especially the United States, the long duration of its influence in the Gulf region. I prefer calling it the Gulf region because there is a dispute whether it's the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. So just referring it to the Gulf. So in the Gulf region, for many decades, we know the American influence that has been prevalent there, especially since the early 1970s. Britain slowly withdrew itself from the West Asian region, and America took its place in exerting, ensuring some kind of stability and balance of power in the region. So with regard to China's role, I would just like to focus on what is China's interest in trying to ensure a kind of stability in the region and reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We know that China has extensively invested in projects in the different West Asian countries in the region as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Several infrastructure projects, transportation, communication, port facilities, and so on. So it is in China's interest that there is much stability in the region, because any kind of conflict or instability can harm its own economic interests, wider economic interests in the region, especially as Dr. Stanley mentioned about the Houthi attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia from 2019 onwards, and even attacks on UAE. China sees a real threat to its own interests if this conflict spreads into newer areas where it has a stake in investing in several projects. So that is China's interest, and precisely that is the reason they have taken this effort to bring about this reconciliation. But at the same time, China had reached a stage where it was sure that after 2 years of negotiations between the Saudis and the Iranians, which are often hosted by Iraq, Oman, and so on, the two countries were in a position to reach an agreement. So it would be a win situation for China if it was seen as brokering this final agreement between the two sides. So it would give a diplomatic boosting for China in such a stage where it is seen as a rising power in the region. When in a situation where there is a strong rivalry between the United States and China, so China will be seen as playing a more proactive role in the region, coming out of this image that it is only focused on economic relations in the region. So this is a new development as far as observers are concerned, and China obviously has these interests as mentioned. So now another aspect which I would like to briefly dwell upon is the change in the regional balance of power. Earlier, we used to see in the post-Second World War context, we used to see the most populous Arab republics, which are most powerful in the Arab politics of the region. For example, countries like Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and so on, who are the most powerful in the regional politics because of strong armed forces, population, and the urbanization and lots of such factors. Whereas on the other side, we see the GCC countries, the Arab Gulf countries, as comparatively weak for a long period of time, despite having their energy resources. The GCC states were not in a position to exert their influence in the regional politics for a very long period of time. That is, and this is one of the reasons why the GCC was formed, because they felt threatened by large countries like Iran, Iraq, and so on. So this was the context until the 2000s. But what we see from the 2000s onwards is a greater attempt to assert their influence in the wider region because of economic prosperity, their growing influence in the region, and so on. So if we see from the 1990s onwards, there have been attempts to develop Qatar's natural gas capability, and a lot of these developments have taken place during this phase. And by the 2000s, they reach a phase where they are more capable of asserting their influence, especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. These three countries are very pivotal among the GCC states, so we're quite influential. And a lot of changes in the wider regional setting also prompted this attempt that we should play a more assertive role. The reason being America's invasion of Iraq and the debacle that followed after that. There was this the sense that the US was slowly cutting down its interventions in the region. It was taking a more cautious role in the region. And this was seen with alarm by the Arab Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, in a situation where Iran was asserting itself in the wider region because of the invasion of Iraq by the US. It provided the opportunity to Iran to exert its influence all the way to Lebanon, what was called the crescent of Iranian influence that extended from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. So the Arab Gulf states understood that this was a situation where they had to exert themselves, and the situation began with the Arab protests of what is called the Arab Spring, the late 2010, and beginning from 2011 onwards, the protests and the civil wars that followed gave the opportunity for the GCC states to play a larger role in the region. But and this led to the heightened rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But now Saudi Arabia has reached a stage where they have realized that the rivalry with Iran is causing it a lot of damage, a lot of its interests are being threatened. And it has decided to, at least since the past 2 years, it has decided that it will work for reconciliation with Iran. This has been already mentioned by Stanley. And one last point that I would like to mention is the threat of non-conventional weapons in the hands of non-state actors in terms of missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, drones, and so on. When these conflicts spread to different parts of the region, and the GCC states are involved in these conflicts, unlike previously, there is a real danger that this conflict can spread into the GCC states, especially when there is such weaponry is available in the hands of non-state actors like the Houthis. So this will be further discussed as part of our discussion. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelley. I think you have covered a large aspect in your initial remarks, where you have talked about China's investment projects and transportation projects in the region, which led China to make the region more stable, so that it is not a threat for themselves as well. So absolutely, we'll now proceed to delve further into the topic during our discussion as well. Both Dr. Stanley and Dr. Shelley has laid a strong foundation with their introductory remarks. And we'll now have the opportunity to explore the Iran-Saudi deal from various angles, considering its implications for the regional stability, global dynamics, and the interest of the other key stakeholders as well. I encourage all the participants to actively engage in the conversation, pose questions, and share their perspectives. So my first question is to Stanley. As we have mentioned before itself, US was a key player in the region before the stepping in of China. And also in the recent article which you have written in the Hindu titled The Understanding the Saudi-Iran Detente, you have mentioned about US deep prioritization of West Asia, which you have mentioned in your introductory remarks as well. So how do you think currently America is tackling the problem at America is also tackling their own problems at national level, because they have other priorities now, like elections are coming up, Russia-Ukraine conflict, and China's dominance in the Indo-Pacific region, etc. So their priorities has shifted right now. This the Middle East is not a #1 priority in their list right now. So how do you think the deal has an impact on the US strategic interest in the region, including its relationship with other key players in the region, which are Israel and Turkey as well?
So there are actually two narratives. One is that the United States is disengaging from the region. I always make a distinction between deprioritization and disengagement. The United States is not retreating from West Asia. It is not disengaging from West Asia, but it has deprioritized West Asia. West Asia would continue to remain an important region from a national security point of view for the United States, for China, for Russia. But how it is changing is that, the United States, at least since the 1970s, the United States was the only superpower in the region. The United States was the most important, most powerful superpower in the region. And now you have more great powers in the region, because through Syria, Russia has established a strong presence in West Asia, whether you like it or not. And China is now, has started playing basically this agreement. The Iran-Saudi deal has actually announced the arrival of China as a major power broker in the region. And this is happening at a time when the United States is facing more conventional challenges, because we know that, since the end of the Cold War, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States faced more non-conventional challenges, security challenges, mainly in terrorist organizations, etc., etc. So this actually hit the roof after the 9/11 attack. But now I think the great power rivalry is back. The United States is, backing up Ukraine against the Russian invasion. So Russia is another great power. And the United States-China competition is heating up in the Indo-Pacific region, because China is now really rising as, it has already become the second largest economy. It has built the world's largest navy, etc., etc. So the old era type great power rivalry is back. So the United States has, its priorities are elsewhere. But at the same time, West Asia being given, it is importance, its strategic importance for energy security, etc., etc. West Asia would continue to play an active role in global politics. So the United States, I think the US approach was that, yes, it has to focus on bigger challenges elsewhere, but how to do it without losing your leverage in the region. So the whole context of the Abraham Accords is that, because for the United States, Israel, and the Arab world, these are the two pillars of its foreign policy, right? But there were issues between these two pillars because of the Palestinian occupation by the Israelis. So the Arabs hadn't recognized Israel, except a few countries. So under the Trump administration, what the United States did was that it wanted to collectivize these two security pillars, these two foreign policy pillars, bring them together, bring them closer. So the bridge was the Abraham Accords. So as part of the Abraham Accords, we saw that 4 Arab countries normalized a relationship with Israel. But I think what both sides would like to have is Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is arguably the most important and most powerful Arab country. And also being the custodian of the two of the holiest mosques in Islam, Saudi king commands some loyalty or some respect among the Muslim world. So Saudi a normalization agreement would be between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be kind of a coup. And if you achieve that, the United States could also bet on retaining some influence, because both the Saudis and the Israelis are your ally, and Iran is your rival. So if you bring together your allies and build a front against your rival, you are actually building a new order in the region, even when you are deprioritizing the region without losing your leverage, without using your influence. I think this is the strategic plan behind the Abraham Accords. But what happened is that the Saudis made their own calculations, because they looked at the United States and they looked at the United States shifting priorities, and they realized that they can't basically continue to be reliant on the United States forever. And secondly, I think Saudi Crown Prince, though he is still keen on normalizing ties with Israel, so if he has already reached out to Iran and neutralized the threats he is facing from Iran, so what the Saudis can do is that they will be in a better bargaining position when they negotiate with the Israelis through the Americans. So the Saudis made their own moves. So the Americans were definitely upset with the Saudi-Iran reconciliation, because we had reports that Bill Burns, the CIA chief, made an unannounced visit to Riyadh and told MBS that he wasn't happy that the Americans were kept out of the whole process. And the Americans also saw the Chinese coming, because China has now established themselves as a major power broker. Because as regards China is concerned, this region would be important because of its energy resources, because China is heavily dependent on imports. And when the Chinese economy grows, which is expected to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy in some time, in a few years. So China has to make sure that the energy supplies remain uninterrupted. So China has a national security interest in stability in the region. So and to ensure the stability, China would play a bigger role in the region, same as the role the United States played in the post-war world, because the United States wanted to make sure uninterrupted energy supplies, so that the United States was ready to play a bigger role in West Asia, what they call the Middle East. And the Chinese would like to do the same thing. So from an American point of view, these are the changes that are happening in the region. Are the Americans happy with the deal? I don't think so. I think they are not happy, because when they look at it, what they are seeing is that from an American point of view, an American ally, who is Saudi Arabia, is coming together with an American rival, which is Iran, in an agreement that was brokered by the United States global rival, which is China. So that's how I think the United States is looking at the reconciliation agreement.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have highlighted an important point where US is not at all interested in this agreement. That was my follow-up question, which you have the answer you have already covered here. And also you have clearly distinguished between the meaning of deprioritization and disengagement, where US is not disengaging from the region, whereas it's only deprioritizing its priorities in the region. So my next question is to Dr. Shelley Johnny. So we know that China had a very limited involvement in the West Asia region in the past that can be contributed to its domestic priority policy of non-interference, US dominance in the region, and evolving global dynamics. So what do you think are the specific interests and objectives that China have in brokering the potential deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and how does it align with China's broader regional and global ambition? Also, do you think this deal will impact the traditional balance of power?
Hello. I think there's been an interruption.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. I couldn't get the last portion of your question.
Yeah, as it was a sub question actually. How do you think this deal will impact the traditional balance of power in West Asia and across the globe?
Okay. See, when we look at the Chinese role in West Asia, and particularly the Gulf region, what we always what we have seen, that is at least from the 1980s onwards, China has been willing to provide ballistic missile technology, chemical and biological weapon. I mean, in a more kind of overt manner, access to these kind of technologies, be it chemical or biological technology during the 1980s. But what happens, and this continues till the 1990s. So as far as West Asian powers are concerned, China is an alternative when it comes to access to these kind of technologies, which America or NATO members, other NATO members would not provide access to such technology to the West Asian powers, especially considering the fact that most of the powers in the region were hostile to Israel, which is a very important ally of the United States. So as far as these powers, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Syria, be it Iraq, these countries are concerned, China was a means to access to these kind of technologies. Even the then Soviets or later on Russia, there were certain limitations with regard to access to these kind of technologies from Russia as well, as far as these countries were concerned. So China was an important influence, factor at that point of time. But then from the 2000s onwards, China decides to change its policy and become a responsible major global player from the 2000s onwards. And we see a kind of shift away from these providing these kind of technologies to being viewed as a rising economic power. This is what China wanted to be seen in the wider world, and move away from its legacy of providing access to these kind of technologies to countries which were regarded as anti-Western. And so from 2000s onwards, we see the rise of China as a major economic power. And then from the 2013 onwards, with the initiation of the Belt and Road Initiative, we see China's global attempt to spread its economic influence through investing in these projects, as I mentioned, in different regions of the world, including West Asia. So as far as China was concerned, the point that I've already mentioned is that it has an interest in maintaining the economic stability in the region for the success of its own projects. And like what Stanley has already mentioned, ensuring the supply of oil to its to the Chinese economy, which is a very important goal as far as China is concerned. So what China recognized was that, now ironically, something that experts have always noticed is China benefited from the fact that America was ensuring in some ways a stability in the wider West Asian region, because the oil supplies would then be safely China could gain access to these oil supplies as long as America as a power was ensuring the stability in the wider region. So that was in the interest of China, that America in some ways was providing the stability which benefited China for so many decades. But now what is happening is when we see the United States slowly reprioritizing its interests in the region, the sense is that China has to proactively ensure that there is kind of stability in the region, that it has to play a hands-on kind of a mode vis-a-vis its sitting by the side kind of approach it used to follow earlier. China has to play a more proactive role in ensuring the stability in the region. And because of its very good relations with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, China was in a position to ensure that this thing would happen. And also, unlike Iraq or Oman, both Saudi Arabia and Iran have deep respect for the Chinese, for China, for China's role in this effort. It's because China was a power that was seen as a rising power. It is given a lot of respect by both Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also from the Saudi perspective, the Chinese have good relations with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and which in turn gives them access to the theocratic regime in Iran. So it is not just some Iranian diplomats giving some assurances. This is high-level Iranian security officials who have links with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, with the theocratic regime, not the government, not the Iranian government, but the real power behind the throne, that is the theocratic authorities and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So China is in a much better position to ensure Iranian compliance with this kind of an agreement. So this was one reason why the Saudis were very positive with regard to looking at China's role. But now, having said that, the reality is America is still the preeminent power in the region, and it is doubtful on how much China will be able to ensure compliance with this agreement if something goes wrong, if Iran does something, goes against the agreement and there is heightened tensions. How far will China be able to, kind of ensure compliance to this agreement is something that we'll have to wait and watch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think right now, with these two questions, we have covered the two great powers' role in the region. So with that, I'll come to the energy aspect of this thing. So my next question is to Stanley. So West Asia holds a crucial position in the global energy landscape. And also the region is very rich in the oil and gas resources, which is 31.3% of the global oil production, making it a key player in the global energy market. And also Iran and Saudi Arabia has been a key suppliers of energy to India as well. So how do you see the potential deal affect the global energy markets, and what opportunities and challenges does this present for India as a major energy importer from these two countries?
So specifically in the energy point of view, we can say that, some amount of stability in the cross-Gulf relationship is good for, energy market and prices. Because it is not that itself is not a great deal. Why it's not a great deal? Because Iran has been heavily sanctioned by the West, by the United States, and Iran continues to remain under the American sanctions. So, the Saudi-Iran reconciliation itself would not allow Iran to start, exporting through the Green Channel to the global energy mainstream. That is not, going to happen in the near term. But at the same time, this tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran had posed challenges to the stability of the global energy supplies. For example, is the 2019 attack on Saudi oil installations by the Iranians or the Iranian proxies that knocked off half of Saudi Arabia's energy production, oil production for a week. Half of Saudi Arabia's oil production. And that was a major shocker. And for Saudi Arabia, that was also an eye-opener, because Saudi Arabia realized that at the end of the day, they have to defend themselves because nobody came for their defense. So, and this, even after that, we saw that there were repeated attacks on Saudi energy infrastructure from Yemen, which is right on the southern edge of, right across the southern border of Saudi Arabia. Because in Yemen, half of Yemen, especially particularly in the northern parts of Yemen, including Sana'a, the capital, are controlled by the Houthi Shia rebels, who are backed and bankrolled and armed by the Iranians. So we saw that immediately after the Saudi-Iran reconciliation agreement, one of Saudi Arabia's diplomats traveled to Sana'a and met the Houthi supreme leader. They held, another round of talks. There is a ceasefire in Yemen for the last few weeks, which is holding. And also, they also agreed to some kind of a prisoner swap agreement. So we see some movement on the Yemen front, which is, which was made possible by the Saudi-Iran reconciliation. If the Saudis and the Iranians were fighting through their proxies, there wouldn't be any peace in Yemen. Now the ceasefire is holding, which means some stability is there. And if the ceasefire is holding, if the Houthis and the Yemeni government of President Mansour al-Hadi, who's apparently in Saudi Arabia, so if they reach some kind of an agreement between the rebels and the government, and the Houthis stop firing missiles into the Gulf countries, that is good news for the energy market. So what we see is that if there is predictability in the Saudi-Iran relationship, which is good for stability for the energy markets. And secondly, the major question of whether Iran would be allowed to start exporting, etc., I think a lot would depend on the United States or the nuclear deal negotiations, which we have to wait and see. And from an Indian point of view, India has substantially reduced its imports from Iran under the US sanctions. But Saudi Arabia, of course, remains one of the major suppliers. This stability in cross-Gulf relationship is good news for India, mainly because India, as we know, is highly dependent on imports. More than 82% of our energy requirements are met through imports. So it is in our interest as well, to have some stability. But more than the energy relationship, Iran is vital for India because Iran is the gateway for India to Central Asia. And with Saudi Arabia or UAE and other Gulf countries, India has excellent relationship. So basically what India needs is that India wants these two, countries across the Gulf. India wants these countries to come together. So if there is an understandable partnership between these two, things would be a lot easier for India from a geopolitical point of view in its engagement with West Asia, for energy security and also for its engagement in Central Asia. So you can see that in recent weeks, to be specific, after the Saudi-Iran reconciliation agreement was announced, India is now trying to reboot its relationship with Iran. So India's national security advisor recently traveled to Iran, into Tehran, where he met the Iranian officials. I was in Iran early last year, in February 2022, and the Iranians were very upset with India because the Iranians were saying that under American pressure, you cut down energy ties, and your investments in Chabahar, they are not picking up pace. So some of the top officials at the Iranian Foreign Ministry telling us. But now, if you look at the relationship, you see a lot of movement. Indian Foreign Minister was talking about stepping up investments in Chabahar, in the Chabahar port, which India is apparently developing. And the Russians are now investing in infrastructure, in building rail networks in Iran, so that Russia would be connected to India, would be connected to Mumbai through Azerbaijan and Iran through the international North-South corridor. So Iran holds importance for India from a geopolitical and strategic point of view, also in an energy perspective. So it is important for India to have, that's what my point, it is critical for India to have some kind of cross-Gulf stability in the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which would make your job a lot easier. And I think you can see that India is definitely welcoming the changes that is happening.
Thank you. India has been in key interest for India's with respect to the energy market and everything. I think it will be beneficial for India as well, the stability in the region because of the deal. And coming to Dr. Shelley, Iran, we know that Iran and Saudi Arabia has been engaged in a lot of proxy wars in the region, whether it be in the Yemen or Syria, etc. So how do you think the deal will impact the ongoing war in Yemen, and which already Stanley has covered, but also in the Syrian region and other proxy Saudi-Iran hostilities and the broader regional dynamics in West Asia? And what are the potential implications for the region's stability and security because of this?
I think one of the more important conflicts as far as this agreement is concerned is a conflict in Yemen, because Saudi Arabia is heavily involved in the conflict in Yemen, and it wants to cut down its presence in Yemen because it has finally realized that it has not been able to meet its objectives in the Yemen conflict. And the best thing that, in fact, its participation in the Yemen conflict is actually hurting its interests, because the attacks that we had mentioned already on Saudi oil installations and facilities from 2019 and then onwards. This is a big threat to the Saudis' implementation of their Vision 2030 program of diversifying their economy and making Saudi Arabia a tourism hub and so on. So as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, its participation in the Yemen conflict has harmed its own interests, and the best thing for it was to cut down its presence in Yemen and slowly withdraw itself from the conflict. So what we are likely going to see is a much we don't know how it's going to turn out, in the sense that how much Saudi Arabia will be withdrawing from the conflict in Yemen, but it looks like that that is a step that it would likely to follow as part in the context of this agreement. But again, we do not know if things can go wrong, because if there is any fallout between Saudi Arabia and Iran because of Iranian support for the Houthis, this could all kind of backfire. We don't know, but from the present trends, it looks like Saudi Arabia wants to withdraw itself from the conflict in Yemen. Now, as far as Syria is concerned, it is a far lesser important conflict as far as the Saudis are concerned, because they are not a major player in the Syrian conflict. At least for the past 2 years, they have been engaging with the Syrian regime to kind of rehabilitate Bashar al-Assad, that is the Syrian president, and Syria back into the Arab League. Saudi Arabia is playing the major role to rehabilitate the Syrian government in the Arab League. So they have been cutting the kind of funding and arms supplies to its proxies in Syria. That is, Saudi Arabia has been cutting its supplies and support for its proxies in Syria, and it has lesser stakes in the Syrian conflict. Though it might demand from Syria that at least try to ensure that the heavy Iranian presence in Syria, if it can be cut down by any ways, it would be favorable as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. But even the Saudis know that the Syrians are in a tough spot, because the Syrian army is divided, it is weak, and it is not capable of holding on to the territories in its country without the support of the Iranian military, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, its militias, that is the Shia militia supported by the Iranians, Hezbollah, and so on. Without their support, the Syrian regime will not be able to hold on to its territories in Syria. So there is a limit to how much the Saudis can demand from the Syrians. So I don't see much of a larger engagement of Saudi Arabia in the conflict in Syria. And as far as Iran is concerned, it would definitely contest any attempts by any powers, including the Syrian government or the Russians or anyone, to suggest that Iran cut back its influence in Syria, because this has been built up over a very long period of time, a huge investment in blood and in resources. So the Iranians will not be willing to kind of withdraw its sphere of from the sphere of influence that it has created, especially its ability to hit at Israel, because it has built up ballistic missile stocks and so on in Syrian territory. So as far as Iran is concerned, Syria is still important. and it is a means to divert attention from its own domestic problems. That is the protests and things that are going on within Iranian territory. So I think generally there will be a cutting down of Saudi intervention in these proxy wars and a desire to refocus on economic diversification, economic development, and the future. So this is what the Saudis will be interested in. So yeah, so that is what I expect the Saudi role in the proxy wars of the region.
Okay, thank you for that elaborative aspect on that. A quick reminder to the listeners, I request you to put in your questions and comments in the chat box of the social media platform that you have logged in. And my final question is a common question to both of you, where I thought of covering the gender aspect in the region. So we know that Saudi Arabia has been on the path of reformation by bringing out various progressive actions for women. For example, in 2018, there has been a ban, the ban on female drivers was lifted, and also since 2019, the country has eliminated some of the restrictions that was imposed through the male guardianship system, allowing women aged over 21 years the right to obtain a passport and to travel without the permission of a male guardian. But at the same time, under the Iran civil code, men and women not only have unequal rights to divorce and in decisions over responsibility of their children, but there are also several discriminatory provisions that limit the women's agency and access to the job market. So with such ideological differences, will these ideological differences have a negative impact on the future success of the deal? So Stanley can go ahead with this.
Yeah, so ideological differences in a sense, some of the reforms Saudi Arabia is initiating now, that Iranians had done long time ago. For example, driving, as you mentioned. Saudi women were allowed to drive just a few years ago. Until then, there was a blanket ban on women driving. Whereas in Iran, it is a much vibrant society when it comes to women participating in public life. And the guardianship law, again, so women in Saudi Arabia were not allowed to step out of their house without a male guardian, even if it's a child, a young boy, but you need a male guardian. So they are eliminating some of these restrictions now, and as part of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's reforms, which is definitely a welcome development. So these are the things the Saudi should have done long ago. So we have to see, because Crown Mohammed bin Salman is now in a commanding position. He hasn't become the king yet, because Saudi Arabia is known for this fractious palace politics. But at this point of time, with the king's blessings, he has authority and he has initiated reforms. He is taking on the Wahhabi establishment, the Salafi establishment of the kingdom. So we have to wait and see how far these reforms would proceed in Saudi Arabia. But I would still say whatever the changes, the social changes that are taking place in the kingdom are welcome developments. Whereas in the case of Iran, where the women's rights, basically what the revolution promised was equal rights. It's called an Islamic revolution, but in content, it wasn't an Islamic revolution. It was a movement against the Shah, in which people from all walks of life participated. And once the Shah was gone, Imam Khomeini came and took the reins of the country. So, but basically the promise of the revolution was different. And Iranian women were much freer, in a sense, from a social point of view. But at the same time in Iran, at the time of the revolution, the female literacy was very low in Iran. I think it was below 20%. Now it is, it is close. It is above 70% or whatever. So in universities in Iran, actually, women, the number of students, if you take the number of students, women students are more than their male counterparts in the universities. So Iran, it is actually a mixed bag. So what our idea of Iran is maybe a bit different, but it is a very complex society. It's a mixed bag. But at the same time, these rights are, it has hit a limit, because women in Iran, they constantly ask for the better freedoms, more freedoms, which the mullahs, which the regime is pushing back. The best example is the death of the Kurdish girl because she was taken into custody because she was not wearing hijab. So there is this movement going on. So we have to see, one of the problems with the Iranian regime is its inability to reform itself. So which is what is producing social crisis for Iran. Not only women's movement, but also other kind of social protests. So we have to see two things. One, whether Iran would be the Iranian regime, which promises equality, etc., etc., but at the same time remains a mullah-driven, conservative, theocratic establishment. Whether the Iranian regime would be able to reform itself, because I think the regime is under pressure. You can see that the revolution is aging. The regime is under pressure. There are constant protests from people, especially driven by the young people of Iran. So the question is whether the regime would be able to reform itself. That is the question we have to look at from the Iranian, point of view. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia, it is a one-man driven reform. It is not a socially charged reform movement. Mohammed bin Salman has a vision. He wanted to remake the Saudi society, and he is championing now reforms. So the question is whether he would be able to sustain these reforms in Saudi Arabia, which is predominantly a conservative kingdom. So we have to see how these developments are. These are push-pull developments. How these developments are taking these countries further. So specifically to your question about these differences, whether it will have any impact on the deal, I don't think so. I think the deal is driven more by geopolitical considerations. So, but the deal faces other geopolitical challenges as well, because one is the American factor, other is the Chinese factor, which Shelley pointed out, whether China would be able to provide the same amount of guarantee. And the third is once the relationship is stabilized, Iran is in a better position. You never know what Iran is going to do next. Iran would not give up its influence so easily in Yemen. It would not give up its influence so easily in Syria. So there is this bad history, more structural factors, that keeps the rivalry alive between these two countries. So those geopolitical challenges would remain, even if there is a tactical de-escalation going on between the kingdom and the republic.
Thank you so much. I would like to know Dr. Shelley's take on this same question. So what do you think? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. See, I agree with Stanley's observation because, see, basically these kind of, especially foreign relations are based on very pragmatic, interests and pragmatism and national interests and so on. So as far as the governments are concerned, they are less influenced by what happens in the domestic spheres of the society, vis-a-vis how the external policies followed by this country affects their own national interests. So that is what they are more interested in. That is how these, the interests, its own national interests are not affected by the foreign policies of a rival. That is what they are more concerned about than the domestic kind of happenings, which might not be of much of a priority as far as, say, for example, Saudi Arabia is concerned. Now, when we come to the reforms within Saudi Arabia, I think we need to keep a couple of things in mind, because the one thing is Mohammed bin Salman, the present crown prince of Saudi Arabia, is very aware of the fact that there has been a major shift in the way the succession to the throne in Saudi Arabia has taken place, because the first ruler of the present day Saudi state, there were 3 Saudi states, this is the third one. The first ruler of Ibn Saudi, who was known as Ibn Saud or Abdulaziz bin Abdul Rahman, who was the first king of the present Saudi state. After his death, the succession was passed on among his sons. That is, it was passed on among his sons. That is, one son dies, the succession goes on to the next, sibling. And that is how the succession pattern had taken place in Saudi Arabia. But now what has happened is there has been a big change where King Salman, who's the present ruler, he has made his own son, Mohammed bin Salman, as a crown prince of Saudi Arabia. So this is a major shift in the way the succession has played out in within Saudi Arabia. So what Mohammed bin Salman expects is that the kind of opposition that would come out from the royal family, from rival princes and power centers and so on. So that danger is there at one level. At the present time, no, I mean, he has almost completely been able to wipe out any visible opposition to his possible succession as a king of Saudi Arabia. But this is one major problem that he is facing. The second aspect is that the Saudi royal family used to gain its legitimacy through the support from the conservative Wahhabi clergy, the Wahhabi religious clergy of Saudi Arabia. And they have provided legitimacy to the Saudi ruling family. But because of the ideology that they have espoused through their education system and so on, the Saudi royal family has time and again faced a lot of threats from within their own society. Beginning from the takeover, the attempted takeover of the Mosque of Mecca in 1979 by religious extremists who are millennial. They were believing in an apocalypse, end of the world kind of an ideology, but it was mainly coming from this kind of religious inspiration. And then later on, we have the threats from Al-Qaeda, that is Bin Laden, Osama Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Then you have the Islamic State and so on. So all of these influences have come out from this Wahhabi ideology, which has been widespread in its own society, which has become a threat to its own society. So there is an attempt to move away from this this legitimacy that is legitimacy should not be dependent on the conservative Wahhabi clergy of Saudi Arabia. It should be on the basis of development, progress, which also will help it attain larger recognition in the wider globe that it is bringing about these reforms and these changes, diversification of its economy, opening up of its society. This will ensure external and domestic support for the continuation of its rule in Saudi Arabia. So this is a strategy that Mohammed bin Salman is following. And so I think we need to be very aware about these aspects, which how much of this is for certain other purposes, for certain political purposes, rather than a genuine attempt to kind of open up society. Because we need to study these, I think, these aspects in very closely in order to understand what is happening. So, so I don't think personally, coming back to your question, I don't think these aspects are going to affect the relations between both sides. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I also, so both of you agree that these aspects does not affect the deal or the relation between both the countries. And since we are running short of time, I'll just take one question from the listeners. So any of you can answer that. So can you please elaborate on whether this reapproachment deal would reshape the security architecture of the West Asia, and what are the newer areas of cooperation India can reprioritize in the region with the changing geopolitics?
Yeah, I can make some quick points and Shelley maybe can add to it. So I don't think this would radically alter the security architecture of the region. I would like to call this tactical de-escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's not a strategic realignment. For that, we have to wait and see. What is happening now is only a tactical realignment. Saudi Arabia wants stability, Iran wants a breathing space. So Saudi Arabia and Iran have come together under China's auspices. So that is what is happening now. And this tactical de-escalation will have some impact, some regional impact. You saw that in Iran. You saw that in Syria. Saudi Arabia is welcoming Syria back to the Arab family. You saw that in Yemen, where talks are taking place. So it will have, this tactical de-escalation will have some regional impact. But in the long term, the strategic reality of the region, would it be rewritten? I'm not so confident, because I look at the structural factors, I still see pitfalls. And you ask about India. So what India has to do? So as I said earlier, both Iran and Saudi Arabia, or both Iran and the Sunni Gulf kingdoms are important for India. Millions of Indians are living there. India needs energy resources like the same as China. We need uninterrupted supply of energy resources. Third, we also see Central Asia as a major opening for India. And for India's entry into the Central Asia, we have invested billions in the Chabahar port. But unfortunately, under the US sanctions, our relationship with Iran had been impacted. But I think India should, given the fact that the Saudis, an American ally, which hosts thousands of American troops, Saudis could overcome the US objection and reach out to the Iranians for some tactical understanding. I think we should take cues from them and then strengthen our relationship with both sides, both the Saudis and the Iranians. With the Saudis, for your energy security, for the safety of your own population, for your cooperation in anti-terrorism, etc., you have multiple layers of your relationship with Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., right? And on the other side with Iran, possibly oil and gas cooperation, but at the same time, strengthen India's Eurasian integration through its ties with Iran and other Central Asian countries. I think that's how India should look at it.
Yeah. So, I think I agree with Stanley's point that there is not going to be much of a change in the security architecture. As it looks, as it appears right now. So I think that part is dealt with. But when it comes to India, I got certain points that I would like to raise. One is, I think India has to be very careful that it does not appear to be siding with any one kind of side in this kind of rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We need to be a bit more, I think we need to be a bit cautious out here, because some reports have stated that some of the troops of the Yemeni government, that is internationally recognized and supported by the Saudis, were provided treatment in India. We don't know if these reports are true or not. And in what appears to be a slight tilt in favor of the Saudi supported government in the Yemeni civil war, I don't think such steps are quite wise considering what is happening right now. Because what we are seeing is that in Yemen, the Houthis are now one of the most powerful entities in that country. And also the Saudis are trying to come up with reconciliation with the Iranians. So whatever India does that kind of appears to show that it is in favor of one side in this conflict can harm its interests in the long run. So I think we have to be very careful about that aspect that, actually India could have played a major role in, leading this reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, considering the kind of traditional relations we have had with both of these countries. So that brings me to my second aspect that I would like to focus on, is how India's diplomacy is still, in certain senses, very reactive to events that are happening in the region. We are not being able to initiate something within the region from by our own accord. We are almost always reacting to developments that are taking place in the region rather than trying to initiate something by ourselves. And this points out to the lesser number of a diplomatic corps, India's diplomatic corps. We have very less number of proper diplomats in India. And this is a very big, a kind of drawback as far as India is concerned. And also in terms of developing capacity in the areas of international relations, diplomacy, foreign policy, strategic studies, and so on. In comparison to China, India's way behind in these aspects in terms of research centers, in terms of university departments, and so on. India still, is a long way behind China in such matters. And also the need for India to use its soft power with regard to relations with West Asia. India has considerable amount of soft power when it comes to relations with West Asia in comparison to China. I mean, India's entire western coast has historically strong relations with West Asia, communities which have very strong relations with West Asia. But unfortunately, we don't appear to be making use of these resources as much as we can. So these are aspects I think that we need to focus on, and we need to be more proactive with regard to a very vital region like West Asia. And we need to understand that we cannot wish away major powers in our neighborhood like Iran. I mean, it is a reality and we need to deal with it. And the best course for us is to maintain good relations with all major powers in the region.
We had a very insightful discussion in such a short time where we covered different aspects of energy, gender, great power politics, and regional dynamics of the Middle East region. So I would like to conclude this webinar by highlighting some key takeaways from what both the speakers has spoke about. So Saudi Arabia is undertaking many foreign policy recalibrations. China has endured as a potentially successful mediator, courtesy in their good relations with both Iran and Saudi, unlike the USA's seesaw relations with Saudi and issues with the Iran. While in Iran, we'll have to wait and see if it will be able to truly reform itself under the pressure from young Iranians desiring for reformation. In case of Saudi Arabia, the reforms are driven by one single leader. Iran will not give up its influence in Yemen and Syria, which will result in some geopolitical challenges between the two nations with regard to the region. Beijing is also stepping up to strengthen its economic relations with regional powers and forge comprehensive strategic partnership with the Arab world and place itself as a reliable global power. China is leveraging the USA's changing relations with the nations in the region and the narrative around the fact that any destabilization in this area can impact their economic interests. There has been a change in the balance of power with the GCC countries gaining a more prominent role in the area as well. Thank you, Dr. Stanley and Dr. Shelley, for such an engaging discussion. Thank you to all the participants for logging in and listening to the conversation so intently, and for your questions as well. I would also like to thank our CPPR organizing team, especially the communication team, for the smooth conduct of this webinar. With this, I would like to formally close today's proceedings. Good evening and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, see you, Stanley.